phenomenon into a phenomenon that will favor sustainable economy. And we will make sure that COP28 be focused on concrete solutions and resolutions. And during this COP28, the Emirates also will focus on 5 main issues: mitigation, adaptation, the negative impacts and the damage, financing, and innovation. In addition to that, the Emirates will continue its cooperation with the African countries in innovative fields, and will also enhance cooperation, partnership, and technical support in fields such in renewable energy and sustainable agriculture in order to enhance sustainable development in the African continent. And based on our confidence of the importance of the role of parliamentarians in the issues related to climate change, we in the Emirates, in cooperation with the presidents of the Pan-African Parliament and IPU, will be involving all the parliamentarians in order to reach concrete solutions for sustainable development and sustainable solutions, and to come up with the major role that should be played by the parliamentarians. In this respect, I would like to call upon you to take part to this COP28 with us to make sure that the voices of our peoples be heard. Let me now share with you a video that will be displayed about COP28. Thank you very much.
You can watch the video now.
Where does your path lead? Can your path lead us to net zero and create a sustainable world?
Climate is changing faster than our capacity to adapt.
We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing.
It is now or never.
Only immediate and drastic action will pull us back from the abyss.
It is going to be hard. The thing we have going for us is that humanity has done hard things before.
The fight against climate change will unite the world as one family.
人类是命运共同体。
إنه ليس مستحيل.
We have the collective capacity to transform.
To rise to the challenge of this moment.
لأن مستقبل أولادنا وأحفادنا يعتمد على الخطوات التي نتخذها اليوم.
So thank you very much, Your Excellency Al Swahidi, for the presentation as well as for the video on COP28. I think this is particularly important for Africa, particularly your remarks, because a big part of the just transition debate in Africa is about what will Africa do about its hydrocarbons and whether, in fact, it is possible to exploit and utilize those hydrocarbons in a way that is powered by renewable resources, by clean energy, but also in a way which supports investments in future clean energy. And I think what I pick from your presentation is that there are, in fact, many important lessons for Africa from the UAE. So I'll be looking forward to learning more about that. To colleagues, Veronica and Ephraim online, there were a couple of questions that were already asked by Aruna regarding the NDCs as well as the global stocktake plan report from Africa. I don't know if you have any immediate responses before we quickly move to the next set of presentations, before we close this session.
Thank you.
Ephraim?
Thank you, James. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I think mostly what Aruna gave were comments, and which we appreciate, but probably also allow me to thank the FDB through Aruna with the support that they have been providing to the AGN, which is very useful, including the organization, James. The ECA has been very supportive. And this is on the issue that Aruna raised on data requirements for the GST. That is very true. In my presentation, I emphasize the need to ensure that the global stocktake is balanced. That is, it handles both adaptation and mitigation. And to do that, we need to provide evidence. We need to have studies that have indicated where are we in terms of adaptation, what is the gap that is remaining, and that requires resources. And that's where the role that the bank has been playing and other Pan-African organizations is critical. But the point I just wanted to indicate there is where are we in terms of global stocktake? So far, what we've been dealing with is the technical aspect of the global stocktake. So we are dealing with the technical aspect. This is where we make submissions as a continent. We negotiate and all that. We are concluding that technical phase in June and make recommendations to the political phase. So at COP28, we expect the political phase to take up the GST, and that's the outcome that will have to be discussed at COP28. Three things in terms of the outcome. One, we may have a decision that our ministers may decide to adopt a decision on the GST, which provides guidance on how we indicate where we are in terms of the status and also indicate the corrective action that needs to be undertaken. Two, it might be a political declaration that comes out so that they deal with everything. You express the concerns, the usual way that declarations are framed, and then something indicated in terms of a way forward in handling the matter. And then you'd have an annex, because there's been rich information that is coming out through the stocktake, and you don't want to lose that. You'd have an annex that includes all these details so that those who are interested in seeing exactly where we are in terms of status on all these streams can have a document that they can quote to in terms of the technical annex, which would be there. So broadly, although I'm jumping the gun in giving those, but that's how the discussion is. Those are the options that we may have as we get through the political phase of the GST. I'll just conclude with emphasizing that as negotiators, we feel proud and empowered if we are supported with the continent in terms of resources. Of course, it is very difficult for you to expect to be provided with support, for example, for these data requirements by a partner whom we are going to compete with in negotiating. That has been our largest cry, which is why Pan-African organizations like AFDB, UNEC and others who provide both material, even data, generated data through studies that they commission are highly appreciated, and we convey our gratitude to that. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you very much, Ephraim, for those comments. I would like to know if, Veronica, you have any final comments before. I see that there are several other questions in the room, but I would like to bring this session to a close, and then we can continue with a panel discussion tomorrow morning, if you will, please. So, Veronica, if you're still online. So apparently we don't have Veronica online anymore. So, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for your participation in this session, and a big thank you to the presenters and to the panelists. Once again, let's give us a round of applause. I will now hand over to the chair of the next session to take us through the final panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And good afternoon, everyone. I know it's been a very long day, and we want to apologize. But we have only 2 more presentations, and then the rest we're going to move for tomorrow, because we've been sitting down for too long. And then also we have the interpreters as well, and it's not an easy job to be moving around. So just bear with us. while we just complete two more presentations, one physical and the other one online, and then we'll call it a day. And first, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Honorable Alhaji Mbow. I'm the Member of Parliament in PAP from the Gambia and the chairperson of the West African Caucus. And I'm glad to be here to moderate the next session. Now, while we are here, so just to avoid too much time wasting, the next presenter is going to be about unpacking key elements for a new Green Deal for Africa's graceful transition. We have the pleasure to introduce Dr. James Murombezi. That's the Officer-in-Chief Climate Change Coordinator, Africa Climate Policy Center. That's the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and he happens to be my co-chairperson. So welcome, Doctor, for your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Honorable. So, as Honorable Mbow says, I'm going to be talking about the key considerations for an African Green Deal. I have a presentation. I don't know if the Secretariat could put it up for me so I can quickly walk through it. My presentation actually is going to focus on the European Green Deal. This is because in order for us to understand and to structure a Green Deal for Africa, we need to look at what has already been designed before us and to understand the impacts and the implications of the biggest Green Deal that has yet been actually developed and is to be operationalized in a few months' time. So if we could have that presentation, please. You could have it in presentation mode. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and context of the European Green Deal and its implications for Africa. And then we'll talk about the key mechanism for the implementation of the European Green Deal, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and how it operates. And then we'll talk about the opportunities that are created by the European Green Deal and conclude with a discussion of how then can Africa learn from this and what can be done to develop an African Green Deal. If we can go to the first slide of the presentation, please. The first slide, no, the next one. Thank you. So we know that there is now many processes of transitioning to net zero, to low carbon growth, and part of those processes is the promulgation of green deals as broad strategies for achieving low emissions development. Now, the European Green Deal, which we must learn from, actually provides a roadmap for socio-economic transition. So it is not just a climate change Green Deal, it is a whole socio-economic transformation guide towards low carbon future. And it aims to deliver on the vision of the Commission to reach net zero by 2050 and to decouple economic growth from resource use and also to leave no person behind. It has 8 detailed policy areas: biodiversity, sustainable food systems, sustainable agriculture, clean energy, sustainable industry, construction and renovation, mobility, and pollution and climate action. But in addition to focusing on these key thematic areas, the Green Deal also reviews more than 50 European laws and redesigns many public policies. And it is also coming up with a European Pact and a European Climate Law. This is akin to what is actually being proposed in the Africa Development Strategy. Next slide, please. The Africa Climate Change and Sustainable Development Strategy was referred to earlier today. But so the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, aims to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. It is also going to create a climate law, the significance of which is that it will have binding greenhouse gas emission targets. It seeks to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 within the next 7 years. And this is going to happen in all sectors, including industry and energy, transport, agriculture, and so on. Primarily, it is a domestic plan. It focuses on achieving sustainability within the European Union, but its impact, in fact, extends beyond the EU. Next slide. The proposed sectors include transportation, where the expectation is that the Green Deal will result in 55% emissions reduction from cars by 2030, 50% reduction of emissions from vans by 2030, and the idea is that by 2035 there should be zero emissions from new cars. That is a complete transition to electric mobility. In construction, again, we have similarly high targets around removing or reducing emissions from buildings, creating jobs, as well as investing in new buildings or in renovations. In energy, which accounts for 75% of EU emissions, the EU Green Deal seeks to reduce emissions by 40%, so that the target for 2030 for increasing the contribution of energy renewables to the total energy system is increased. We also have a contribution of nature-based solutions, which are expected to reduce up to 310 metric tons of carbon dioxide, also by 2030. And then, of course, the EU seeks to increase its investment in climate action by adding 30% of the EU's neighborhood development and international cooperation instrument to support climate objectives. But it also seeks to support climate actions outside of the EU by ensuring that 1/3 of the public climate finance from the EU also is directed to its member states. Next slide. So the focus, although it is an internal policy instrument, it will actually have global spillovers, particularly in Africa, because of the historical trading and colonial ties between our continents. And the impacts of the EGD will be felt mostly in agriculture, in fossil fuels, and in other natural resources. Next slide, please. Now here we start looking at the implications of the EGD. Next slide. So in the energy sector, for instance, we know that there is already a decline in European demand for fossil fuels. Again, this is important for Africa because Africa is discovering new reserves of fossil fuels. What is going to happen? How are we going to invest and utilize those reserves? But while there's a decline in fossil fuels, there will also be an increase in demand for critical raw materials for the energy transition. Raw materials such as cobalt, nickel, and other critical raw materials. So the implications, therefore, are twofold. For fuel-dependent economies, there will be significant negative implications, while for mineral-rich African countries, there could be significant benefits from the implementation of the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. This slide basically just looks at how demand is shifting from fossil to cleaner sources of energy. I believe the presentations will be made available to everyone. So I'll not go into detail in all of these. You may be able to read them for yourselves. Next slide, please. So in terms of the critical raw materials, here we are seeking to demonstrate what is happening in terms of the demand for critical raw materials. We know that low carbon energy strategies are going to depend on critical raw materials for the transition to clean energy and clean technologies. By 2030, the consumption of these clean raw materials is projected to increase by 4 times for graphite, 5 times for cobalt, 18 times for lithium. And the consumption is actually projected to increase by 13% for cobalt and 14% for lithium by 2050. These are huge increases in the use of critical raw materials. On the right-hand side there, we have a column that is showing the actual sources of the critical raw materials in Africa and how much of each they supply to the EU market only. So Morocco currently supplies 28% of the barite requirements of the EU. Guinea supplies 64% of bauxite of the EU. DRC accounts for 68% of EU cobalt consumption. DRC also accounts for 36% of EU tantalum consumption. South Africa supplies 90% of the EU's platinum group of metals requirements. So these are huge supplies from African continent, and therefore huge opportunities for Africa to benefit from the Green Deal and the transition to low carbon development in the EU. We also look at potential benefits from the agriculture sector. Again, there are significant benefits. We'll go to the next slide, please. Next slide. The EU also looks at developing a circular economy which will reduce material use through reusing and recycling, again with potential benefits for our continent. Next slide. Similarly, the development and deployment of new technologies and the particularly commercial applications of green technologies are also going to have significant benefits for Africa. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in terms of financing, and this is where I think we need to begin to pay attention to what we develop in Africa in response to the EGD, is that the Commission estimates annual investment requirements for the implementation of the Green Deal to be around 260 billion euros. This is every year in order to support that transition to low carbon development. In total, the EU aims to mobilize 1 trillion euros in sustainable developments over 10 years. And this is going to be raised through the operation of international carbon markets, as well as the revision of the EU emissions trading system and the implementation of a carbon border mechanism. And this is why I want us to spend a little bit of time discussing the operation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because this will have significant implications for us. Next slide, please. We can skip that one, and we can also skip the next slide and go to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, Europe's efforts to go neutral by 2050 could actually be undermined by carbon emissions that are coming from Europe's trading partners through carbon leakage. This occurs, for instance, when companies transfer production to countries that are strict or less strict about emissions. So in other words, if Africa continues to produce high carbon intensity goods and services, these goods and services are traded in the European Union, and therefore they will increase the amount of carbon emissions that are accumulating in the European Union. And therefore, in order to eliminate the possibility of this type of leakage, the EU is implementing, as part of its new Green Deal, a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It is designed to ensure that the carbon of inputs coming into the EU is actually taxed at the rate of the cost of a unit of carbon that is traded on the EU market. We'll get more information about the operation of carbon markets in the coming presentations. But I think let's spend a little bit of our time on how this actually works. Next slide, please. So the tool, next slide. The mechanism, CBAM, is a tool which is designed to put a fair price on the carbon that is emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods entering the EU. It is also going to encourage cleaner production within the EU, but also in trade with other non-EU countries. The design is to ensure that the CBAM will capture more than 50% of the emissions in EU emissions trading systems covered sectors. I'll talk about those sectors now. If I go to the next slide so I can begin to discuss some of the details of the CBAM. Now, the first step, of course, of understanding the rate at which CBAM is going to calculate the carbon is to understand the rate at which each ton of carbon is going to be taxed. And this is based on the European emissions trading system. The CBAM will be defined based on the carbon price established by all firms that are participating in the European emissions trading system. And products that are imported within the EU are supposed to be within the scope of the CBAM. And to do that, to be within the scope, they will have to pay for their emissions at a rate which is equivalent to that of the ETS. The operation of the trading system itself is actually based on the issuing of CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism certificates, which will be calculated depending on the weekly average auction price of the EU emissions trading allowances. If we go to the next slide, which explains more how this is going to work. So the CBAM will actually come into operation as of 1st of October 2023. 1st of October this year. And once it is in place as of 1st of October this year, what will happen is that all EU importers of goods that are covered by the mechanism will need to buy certificates, emission certificates. The price of those certificates will be calculated depending on the weekly auction price of the EU emissions trading system, which is expressed in euros per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. Just by way of brief background, a carbon credit is basically a credit that is issued for every ton of carbon dioxide which is saved from the atmosphere, either saved or stored. Saved in the sense of if a production system or process reduces emissions by a ton of carbon, then you get a certificate. Or if a system anywhere else in the world can store that carbon, you also get a certificate. So how it works, for instance, in Africa, to give a simple example, is that we have experience for using African ecosystems such as forests and wetlands to store carbon. So you get a project developer coming to your country and identifying a forest which can be managed either in a protected area, in a community area, in an urban area, or wherever, which can be managed to store carbon dioxide. The forest does that simply by existing, by not being disturbed. Then you can calculate the amount of carbon that is stored within that particular forest by looking at the number of trees, the size of the trees, the age, the species, and so on. And if, say, you have a forest that is capable of storing 100 tons of carbon per year, you get certificates equivalent to 100 tons of carbon per year. And these are valued at the cost of a ton of carbon. In the EU, I'll come to that now, but I think the current price for a ton of carbon in the EU is about 80 euros. In Africa, this price has always remained very low. It's somewhere between 7 and 10 euros per ton of carbon. And of course, for carbon markets to be attractive to Africa, we need to raise the price of carbon to competitive international standards. And we have mechanisms for doing that. We are, for instance, at the UNECA working on developing a carbon registry for African carbon credits. So next slide, please. This is just a graphic explanation of the operation of the CBAM. So importers of goods and services covered by the CBAM will register the goods that they are going to be importing with the national authorities in their European countries. In those authorities, they can also buy CBAM certificates, which are priced weekly on the ETS, as we have said. The importer then declares the emissions that are embedded in the goods and services that are they are importing. So those emissions are again measured in tons of carbon dioxide. And if they have certificates that can pay for all of those emissions, they exchange their certificates. If the certificates are not adequate, then they pay a tax. If the importers can prove that a carbon price has already been paid during the production of the goods, then the amount that has already been paid is deducted from the carbon credits. So, well, this is complex. I know we are rushing through this. We can explain it in greater detail. We are available, but we want to understand the implications of the CBAM for Africa. So it will be introduced in 2023 October with a 3-year transition period, during which only emissions reporting obligations will apply without any financial adjustments. But after the transition period, the CBAM will then begin to phase in payments for the carbon. And it is going to initially from 2023, it will cover imports of iron and steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizer, hydrogen, and electricity from non-EU countries, including Africa, of course. Now, it is likely to hit the competitiveness of African exports, particularly industrial exports, and especially if product coverage expands to other products over time. Next slide, please. Next one. So yeah, those are the sectors that are going to be covered by the CBAM in the first iteration from October. If we go to the next one, here we explain a little bit the EU trading system for emissions. Again, you'll get all of this information, but it explains how a cap and trade system works and how it can actually affect the carbon price, which is the next slide. The next slide is dealing with what has been happening with carbon pricing in the EU, but also elsewhere. And it actually demonstrates that within the EU, the carbon price has actually increased from around 5 euros per ton of carbon dioxide in 2017 to a current price of about 80 euros per ton of carbon in 2021. And this has actually raised revenue that is grown from about 31 billion euros in 2021 to, from about 25 billion in 2021 to 31 billion euros from just carbon trading. So there is a good amount of money that can be raised from the carbon markets. And I think this is a potential development which an African Green Deal can address. Next slide, please. The next slide really is just a graph which shows the growth of the carbon market in terms of the price of carbon from 2021 to 2022. You can see it is fluctuating, but the trajectory is generally upward. Next slide. Again, I'll just skip through that. It is showing graphically where the revenues are emanating from and what they are being used for. So you have revenues from carbon trading being used for domestic climate change and energy uses, for international climate change, for energy purposes, and so on. The next slide, we'll skip that. This actually shows, this is the methods, the tools that we have been using to try and measure the potential impacts of the CBAM on African economies. So we have used two models there. We will not discuss them now. So you can skip through this slide and the next one. And here, just the next slide, please. And I'll probably stop after these next two slides. So the next slide basically sort of tries to show some of the potential impacts of a CBAM on African exports. It shows that currently Africa is exporting 26% of the EU's fertilizer consumption, 16% of the EU's iron and steel, 12% of the EU's aluminum, 12% of the EU's cement. When the CBAM comes into effect, it's likely to immediately result in reductions of aluminium to 13.9%, by 13.9%. Iron and steel exports to the EU will drop by 8.2%, fertilizer by 3.9%, cement by 3.1%. I chose these sectors because these are energy-intensive sectors, and these are also hard to abate sectors in the sense that they use a lot of fossil fuels and they're very difficult to reduce. So I'll skip the next slides and just go to the slide which shows the sort of the advantages of technology-based versus commodity-based development opportunities. So carbon is a commodity, and development in carbon in the carbon age is actually driven by the trading within that commodity. And this has got many challenges that are outlined in that particular slide. Again, in the interest of time, let me skip that and go to the final slide. So the question was, what should an African Green Deal be? How can it be structured? I know I didn't answer this question. We just presented what the EU Green Deal is. But for Africa, the key questions are, firstly, an African Green Deal should promote sustainable development pathways for the continent, right? Because our priority in Africa is development. Let's face it, our priority is not climate change, because we, in fact, actually have many developmental gaps. Although climate change is impacting on us, our ability to respond to climate change depends on our ability to build resilience. And to build resilience, we need development. So therefore, an Africa Green Deal will have to be able to balance Africa's development priorities with Africa's climate change responsibilities. But will addressing climate change itself actually enable Africa to also address the developmental challenges facing the continent? That's a question that has to be resolved in an African Green Deal. How will an African Green Deal relate to other climate frameworks, such as the European Green Deal and other development frameworks across the world? And is an African Green Deal an internal deal between African member states, or is it a deal between Africa and the rest of the world, or is it both? And if it is both, how is it going to be negotiated? And finally, we have seen the difficulties of financing the African climate response so far. So how will an African deal be financed? Allow me to stop there and say that the presentation does go into detail on some of these questions, and I hope when it's circulated, we can have more opportunities for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor, for that brilliant presentation about the European Green Deal, and also what we think we need to do as a continent, that is the continent of Africa. Whatever we need to do, essentially, is to promote sustainable development. That's from you, and also to be able to balance development priorities and also climate change. So we're going to leave it at that because we are really running out of time. We have only 10 more minutes, and we need to call in online Alhaji Janj, AGN lead negotiator of Article 6. We have only 5 minutes for him before we finally close with Dr. Dosuma Alhamdu. So if we have Alhaji on the line, can we bring him? We have only 5 minutes for him online, for the online presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Honorable Alhaji. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
And you see also my presentation?
Yes, we can see all. Go ahead.
Okay. Let's go to the first slide. Thank you. Honorable member of the African Parliament, distinguished guests, I'm really pleased to make this presentation on carbon market and biodiversity. I'm Alhaji Mbaye Janj from Senegal, lead coordinator for carbon market for the African group. When it comes now to biodiversity and climate change, we know that the nature helps both mitigation against and adapt to the worst effect of the climate crisis. And that was told by the science that tell us that we cannot address climate change without biodiversity conservation and vice versa. And also the IPCC said manage a natural terrestrial ecosystem absorb around 1/3 of the CO2 emission from 2010 to 2019. It was demonstrated by research that nature-based solution, in particular forest-based action for mitigating climate change, can provide an important part of the mitigation needed to limit the global warming to below 2 degrees, and therefore play a role in meeting the goal of the Paris Agreement. But the experts also said that this should be seen as a complementary to and not in lieu to ambitious mitigation targets in all the sectors that generate GHG, because we need to use the nature-based solutions, but continue also to have a very ambitious mitigation target. And we have seen in COP25, UNFCCC COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, as well as the CBD COP in Montreal, that biodiversity and climate change are closely linked. And it was said in Sharm el-Sheikh that the goal of the Paris Agreement cannot be achieved without drastically reducing the threat to biodiversity. And in Montreal, we equally said that the proposed target and goal of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework cannot be reached without more ambitious emission reduction target and more urgent adaptation actions. And we have seen that under the UNFCCC, we have many nature-based solutions, including the REDD+, which is for a very high interest for the African. And in the decision on REDD+, we have 5 eligible actions: reducing emission from deforestation, reducing emission from forest degradation, conservation of forest carbon stock, sustainable management of forests, enhancement of forest carbon stock. And those are the activities that are in REDD+. We need to keep that in mind. And under the Paris Agreement, we have 2 articles that can address the issues of nature-based solutions, including mainly forest activities. We have the Article 5 of the Paris Agreement that says that the parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate sink and reservoirs of GHG, as referred to the Article 4.1 of the Convention, including forests. Parties are encouraged to take action to implement the support, including through result-based payment, the existing framework as set out in related guidance and decision already agreed on the Convention for policy approaches and positive incentives for activities relating to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stock in developing countries, meaning all the activities within the REDD+ framework. We also said that in Article 5, alternative policy approaches such as mitigation and adaptation approaches for the integral and sustainable management of forests will be of high importance of incentivizing upgrade non-market-based approaches. We have also the Article 6, which is about voluntary cooperation. Voluntary cooperation for the implementation of the parties' NDC for higher ambition in mitigation and adaptation action, but also to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. We have, under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, 3 approaches. The first one is called cooperative approaches and was addressed under Para 2 and 3 of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This approach involved the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes for the implementation of NDC. That means emission reduction from a country can be internationally transferred to another one and used to meet its NDC. That cooperative approach needs to be voluntary and authorized by the participating party. That means the host country, for example, Kenya, when a PP within Kenya wanted to transfer international mitigation outcome emission reductions, that project participant needs to have the authorization of the Kenyan government. The second mechanism is the mechanism for mitigation and sustainable development, addressed under the Para 4 to Para 7 of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It's an UNFCCC mechanism under the authority and the direction of the CMA, the Conference of Parties as a meeting of party on the Paris Agreement, and under the supervision of a supervisory body designated by this CMA. That mechanism aims to encourage and facilitate participation in the reduction of GHG by public and private entities authorized by party. Here also, you need the authorization of the participating parties, meaning the countries. And we have lastly, the last mechanism is a framework for non-market-based approaches which supports the implementation of NDC in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. That mechanism aims to promote mitigation and adaptation, enhance the public and private participation in the implementation of NDC, but also the synergy and coherence between the different mechanisms and relevant institutional arrangement under the UNFCCC. Now, how removals are addressed under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, the CMA requested in Glasgow, in its rules of procedures, requested the supervisory body of the 6.4 mechanism, which is the UNFCCC mechanism, to elaborate and further develop on the basis of the rules of modality of the mechanism, recommendation on activities involving removals, including appropriate monitoring, reporting, accounting, crediting period, addressing reversal, avoiding leakage, and avoiding negative impact, environmental impact and social impacts. And what are the type of removals under this Article 6.4 mechanism, which is the UNFCCC mechanism? We have removals through biosequestration, photosynthesis. They are land-based activities. We have a lot of that in Africa, in addressing afforestation, reforestation, and forest restoration, revegetation, improved forest management, wetland restoration, agroforestry, urban forestry, soil carbon sequestration in croplands, soil carbon sequestration in grassland. Out of these land-based activities, we have removals through engineering or chemical methods. We call them engineering-based activities. We have a direct air removals. We have enhanced rock weathering. We have ocean alkalinization and ocean fertilization. And because we are a lot interested in Africa on forest activities, meaning the land-based removals, we have some example of type of activities that can be addressed under the mechanisms that are in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We are still building the rules, and the supervisory body of the 6.4, as well as the SAPSA, are requested to make recommendation, and decision will be taken at the COP 27 during the CMA 5. And we see that under the Article 6.2, which deals with the transfer of international mitigation outcome, we can have all the national, subnational RED Plus activity programs, and we can have the joint crediting mechanism when it addresses RED Plus. In the past, we have under the CDM, which is the KP, the Kyoto Protocol mechanism, under the UNFCCC, only afforestation and reforestation activities are considered under that UNFCCC mechanism. In this new one, we can expand the methodologies and have more than afforestation and reforestation. But we have to address all those issues as African if we are interested on. And under the non-market-based approaches, which is Article 6.8, we can have the RED Plus result-based payment without transfer, because we need to highlight here that under the Article 6.8, there is no transfer, international transfer of emission reduction. We have all the capacity building support, all the technology transfer, and joint mitigation and adaptation activities. What are the way forward? Because I wanted to be short because we don't have a lot of time. We need to make recommendation at the next COP in next November to the CMA4. And that recommendation will be based on submissions by parties and observers, technical workshops, technical paper to be prepared by the Secretariat based on the submissions and the result of the technical workshops. And based on all of that, the SAPSA chair will prepare draft decision. And those draft decisions will be negotiated in Dubai. And at the end of the day, we will take decision in relation to all activities for the mechanism 6.4 as well as 6.2.
Mr. Mbai? Mr. Mbai?
Yeah, I just finished.
Yes, sorry for just cutting you, but can you summarize it? Because we are really running out of time. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's the last slide. Okay. Just to let you know that if we want to really participate and get our concern be taken into account in the final decision and the rules of the Article 6, we need to make submissions with our institutions. We need to participate in that workshop and get our views taken into account. And at the end of the day, have the final recommendation capturing our concern. I thank you again. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mbai Mujembai, for the presentation. And again, it's really very quite clear on the biodiversity and the climate change, and also the natural-based solutions that you actually highlighted very clearly. And we want to thank you for that. And while we are trying to really save time, we want to call the last presenter. That's the climate finance mechanism and how to make them work from the Africa Development Bank. So, my brother, if you can make it 5 minutes, and we'll be really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and you are welcome.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I know the time is running.
Yes.
Good afternoon, honorable members of African Parliament, distinguished participants, guests. A lot has been said since morning. I will keep it short and go to the main information. I have the presentation. Can you put the slide on? Can we have the presentation? But before, when the technicians are busy with that, just to underscore that the 2023 World Economic Forum report on global risk indicated that climate and disaster risk will be among the top global risks that we need to deal with in the next 3 years, 10 years. That call for African position, African state, to really look at how we do planning, how there is need for us to consider climate change in planning, including development plan, the investment associated with development plan document. Countries are updating their national development plan, how to best integrate climate change in existing instruments that we have. It's very clear that we can achieve this only with fiscal policies, because the climate finance needs with Africa depend on the sources is huge, and fiscal instruments are not enough to meet that financial gap. But what we know is how can we improve the existing instrument that we have within Africa? If you look at the climate policy initiative report on climate finance landscape in Africa, we can see that most of the climate finance coming to Africa are predominantly public sources, public climate finance. And public climate finance more within multilateral development institution. So those financial sources are more concessional climate finance. And which sectors are receiving more those resources? You have energy sectors that are receiving more than even agriculture, forest, and land use. And just the previous speakers just highlight forest in Article 6. Africa has huge potential in land-based financing, but current climate finance to that sectors are very low. This also calls us why it's very low. Another fact that I also want to share with you is the debt. So concessional finance are more debt instrument. And if you look at Africa debt to GDP over recent years, debt to GDP ratio are very high, over 53% toward 2024, meaning that traditional concessional finance are no longer appropriate with African context. So how can we improve those existing finance? We need private sectors. If you look at figures published by IMF in 2020 on private sectors financing across Africa, you will see that the liquidity funds are very high in Africa compared to active fund, meaning that private sectors are not really having enabled environment to operate. And among the risk for private sector's participation in Africa is project risk, project associated risk. Because for private sectors, there are various instruments. It can be build, operate, and transfer. A project that is designed to be built, operate, and transfer by private sectors. But how this can be achieved in a country where there is no public-private sector partnership framework, that I think that's where parliamentarians need really to play a critical role for countries to have such instruments that will really enable private sectors to operate and reduce the associated risk with projects. There are also regulatory issues with project design, where climate is not integrated in project risk assessment. And this also creates a number of uncertainty. So private sectors don't like to operate in an environment where there is risk because of the return of the investment. I think that's where parliamentarians really need to take this further to improve regulatory framework in countries. We talk about investment in AFOLU that we need, but land policies, how outdated are our land policies? So if we are going to COP28 and we need to produce import for Article 6, forest in Article 6, how our land policies? What can we do to improve our land policies to enable investment, land-based investment? So among emerging instruments in Africa, linked to blending concessional finance, debt swap to climate are emerging as innovative instrument in Africa, across Africa, that we can use that potential. Seychelles is among first African countries to use that instrument of debt swap to climate. But how can we do debt swap to climate when the portfolio of climate is sitting only with the Ministry of Environment? Because this is very critical. How can we shift the debate to give that portfolio of climate change to Ministry of Finance, because they are the ones that are going for negotiation, loan negotiation. But how can we also do this when our debt sustainability and assessment, a lot of countries are producing debt sustainability report, but climate change is not integrated? How can we earlier integrate climate change in our budgeting process so that earlier from the parliament engagement, you bring those issues and those can be addressed to improve the enabled environment so that both public sectors can benefit from the process as well as private sectors. We have a number of countries that have development bank. Those are very critical instruments that we can use to mobilize climate finance. What are the corporate governance for those banks, those national development bank? Is it not time to reform, to review the corporate governance of those banks so that those banks can be a catalytic instrument to mobilize climate finance in countries and complement effort? I know some countries has also national climate change fund. How to operationalize those? We need regulatory framework, and parliament work are very critical to bring those information so that the reform that we need to do to prepare our climate finance regulatory framework really help us to achieve those goals. Within African Development Bank, effort to bring on board blending concessional finance. The bank, after approving its climate change policy and strategy 2021-2030, has recently approved a climate action windows. So this is your bank climate action windows that will support the bank concessional finance, but innovative concessional finance. And this is targeting 12 billion over 3 years. It will focus on adaptation, 60% allocation, 30% mitigation, 10% technical assistance. And I think the bank is planning to engage more with countries over forthcoming months, and I think parliamentary members need really to play a critical role in engaging with government so that that blending finance really align with country priorities and take into account also country ownership. Another critical instrument that I want also to highlight on the need to strengthen capital market. So just the previous speakers spoke about CBM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. He showed some sectors, but how can we take advantage of this if we don't have sustainable finance framework? So countries don't have sustainable finance framework to classify those sectors. Where are those sectors? Which sectors that financing those activities will be considered as climate finance that can really support private investment in those sectors that you highlighted, so that the private sector's operation in Africa don't be considered as a risk, because when there is uncertainty, although they will operate in Africa, it will not bring any value for the export good in Europe. So that's why we need those regulatory framework so that it gives confidence to the private sectors to invest. The potential in Africa is huge, and we really need to work together to achieve those targets. From the bank perspective, the bank has the African Financial Alliance for Climate Change that is building the capacity of African financial sectors to improve the technical capacity, to improve the corporate governance, to have sustainable finance framework. And this is also a facility that can also support countries. I previously speak about climate, national development bank, national utility fund, countries has national fund for energy, for instance, national development bank for agriculture, all those instruments that we have, and we need to work to improve them so that they can work for us to meet our interests. Thank you. Over. Is there any question? Yeah.
I think so. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much for ably representing Dr. Dosuma on the climate finance. And I think, members of parliament, I think he has highlighted key areas that we need to take a look at in our respective countries, particularly the public-private partnership frameworks that many African countries do not have. And I think there's a need for us to take a close look at that. Very critical, because it's really needed as an instrument to allow the private sector to be able to invest, particularly in our own countries. Again, where you don't have those frameworks, it's going to be difficult to do BOT, which is the build, operate, and transfer. It's going to be extremely difficult because you need to have some kind of framework. And another one also is about the capital markets also. Again, this is an area that also, we as an African country, a lot of our countries actually do not have that. Luckily for my country, Gambia, we passed that law just almost 2 years ago. And again, the need to take a look at land policy and ownership in the continent. And again, this goes back to all the parliamentarians that we really need to look at that in our own respective countries, just to ensure that we're able to get some of this concessionary financing that my brother was actually talking about. Really, we do not have a lot of time right now. I think we run out of time. And the Secretariat, if you would like to make any announcement, I think we can do that. But if we can take one question, or you want to, Honorable, you want to intervene?
What will happen to the other papers here?
We're gonna squeeze them tomorrow in our schedule.
Or we will defeat it till tomorrow?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have to do that.
But tomorrow, if you can allow also discussion from us.
Yes, in fact, we have not done the panel discussion yet on these presentations. So we try to find a way tomorrow to be very innovative. The Secretariat is here. They're going to help us in the innovation to see what we can
do. Talking without us talk.
Yes.
Yes, good evening, honorable members. Good evening, participants. Just to let you know that the presentations that we couldn't take today, we'll take it tomorrow morning, and that's why we are pleading that you come early. By 8:30 tomorrow, we are going to start the meeting, have the presentations, and a few panel discussions before. We know that the President of Kenya will be arriving tomorrow, so we need to get these things done before he arrives. So we plead that by 8:30, all of us are here to start the meeting. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For